What place does leadership, a concept that perfuses all sorts of different industries and has been talked about for generations, what does that have to do with this podcast? The Next Better podcast dedicated to high performing, high achieving individuals who are servant hearted and growth minded. Well, if you want to do anything in life where you're contributing meaningfully to the world, you're going to have to influence people in some way. And so, my conversation with Andrew Oxley, the founder of the Oxley Group, and somebody who's been leading for over 4 decades, that's what it's all about. How do we better understand what leadership means? What are some of the biggest shifts that are happening in leadership today? What should younger individuals or people who are coming into a role of leadership better understand about what it means to serve others and to influence others? And what is the litmus test for determining whether or not you have what it takes to be a leader in your own organization? Those are all the things that we talk about in today's episode of the Next Better podcast with Andrew Oxley. Check it out. Andrew Oxley, so excited to have you on board. Thank you so much for coming in today to talk to us about this thing called leadership.
Well, I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So we just got done talking. It's so ironic. I mentioned to you that on our last episode, or at least last maybe couple episodes, we had a guy named Michael Haig who tells stories. And I mentioned this idea of the hero, and you actually just hopped right in and said, well, ironically, what we talk about in leadership is this idea of being one of three roles when you become a leader. Could you tell us a little bit? Could you say that again? Because I really think people would resonate with that on the show.
Yeah. Well, and if you're in a leadership role, in fact, no matter what role you're in, you've all been asked that question, right? How was your day? And sometimes we ask that question to people and we want to know, but sometimes we were just making conversation and we didn't really want to know, but they still tell us this long story about how their day was. But when we talk about our day, we usually talk about what went well, what went wrong, or same crap, different day, But when your employees go home, somebody asks them how was their day, and you're present in that story. And the question really we always ask our clients is, are you present in the role you want to be present in? And so the three roles we discussed were the villain, the hero, and the guide. Now, nobody really self-identifies as a villain, but I've been doing this for years. And when I ask my clients, tell me about villain bosses you've heard of or that you've had, nobody hesitates to tell me like characteristics. So there's villain bosses out there somewhere. Now, I'm not saying we stay in the villain role all day long, but I think what actually happens is we flip into villain role when we get tired of being in the hero role, which is where we're doing everything for people. We're the stopgap. We're the person who does what our people either can't or won't or don't have the bandwidth to do. And we're exhausted at the end of the day. So people spend a lot of time in the hero role and then they get tired and they get frustrated and they maybe flip over to the villain role for a little while. Then they get frustrated and realize they shouldn't be doing that. So they go back to the hero role. But the only self-perpetuating role, the only role that really has legs and will create an organization that can move forward into the future is the role of the guide. And that's what we're really working with our clients, is how to be more of a guide where we're allowing our employees to be the hero of their own story and not trying to grab that mantle from them. Because if you're the hero, they're just a bit player in your story. And nobody really wants to go home and tell their spouse or their significant other, well, I didn't really do a whole lot. I didn't get to make many decisions. Even the decisions I had, my boss sort of took away from me and shined up a little bit and gave back to me. But we want to go home and say, here's what I accomplished and here's what I did. And yeah, I worked for a great boss, but I got to make decisions and I got to contribute.
What's ironic is when you're a leader in that regard and you see yourself as a guide and you work in that way, ironically enough, your team goes home and talks about how awesome you are. Because, Maya Angelou said it best, people forget what you say and what you do, but no one forgets how you make them feel. So when you make them feel like the hero of their own story, well, lo and behold, they actually say a lot of positive things about you. So I think that that's great.
Yeah. It's true. And, leaders always say to me, well, I actually had a leader tell me one time, he said, don't you sometimes just have to be the villain though? I mean, don't you sometimes have to kick people in the butt? And there's this misconception about guides that they're soft or they're, maybe they just, coddle people. And I'm like, nothing could be further from the truth. Because when we talk to people about their best boss, they were tough, they were direct, but they supported that person. They believed in you. They pushed you. So they were a guide. They weren't like there weren't somebody who didn't push you. There almost always it was somebody who pushed you hard, who believed in you, who, maybe you were able to accomplish things working for that person that you weren't able maybe to accomplish by yourself. And that's what really the definition of a great leader.
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny because a lot of people, when they hear this, especially the high achievers that listen to this show, they go, "Well, I'm the hero. I want to be the one that saves the world and does the things." And the people who listen to this show are also servant hearted. So don't get me wrong, they want to do things for others, but they want to be the hero. And so one of the things that I mentioned to you is this idea of like, I want to be the hero of my own story. I think everybody is the hero of their own story. But I think it's a mental shift for leaders to better understand what it means to be a guide. So how do you help people reconcile that idea of like, I'm the one in charge, I'm the tip of the spear, right? But they also have to recognize that they need to take this role as the guide. How do you help them come to terms with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because everyone wants to be the hero of their own story. I want to be, you want to be, but the question as a leader, how do we get other people to engage? And I think it goes fundamentally to what it means to be a great leader. And when we talk about leadership with our clients, we say that if a journey is not involved, a leader is not required. And so
Mm.
leadership implies there's a journey. You're going from somewhere to somewhere. The problem for a lot of leaders is they make an assumption that the end points of the journey are understood by the person they're leading. The person understands where they're coming from and they're excited about where they're going. And I have found that rarely is that true. The person may disagree about where they are. They may even empirically, like factually, could measure, but they disagree about why. Like, think about a salesperson. They may agree that their sales are not where they need to be, but they disagree why. So all my help, in quotation points, is not really helping them because they don't agree that what the problem really is. And then the other question is, are they excited about where they're going? So this gets to where the hero question comes in. If I wander around in most organizations and ask people, where are you headed? What are you excited about that's happening? They look at me funny, like, excited? We're at work. I'm excited about stuff I do outside of work, not at work. And so I'm like, so to be an effective leader and allow people to be the hero of their story, you have to understand what their story is. What is it they're trying to accomplish? And you have to figure out how to weave that into the greater story of what you're trying to accomplish as a leader. And the interesting thing is, this isn't even that hard if you really start looking for, what are you passionate about? What are you trying to accomplish? What's the thing in our industry that is so, but if it wasn't so, it would be so amazing. It would be such a great thing if we could fix this. So the example a lot of people often talk about with respect to this is Southwest Airlines. When they first got started, the wrong they were trying to right was that it was expensive to fly, right? And so they were like, let's find a way to make it not expensive to fly. And they got all their employees to be super excited about that. And then everything they did. So that was the story that their employees bought into, that they could be part of, that they could be passionate about. And it was woven into the entire fabric of Southwest's story. And so they could allow that gate agent to be the hero. They could allow that flight attendant to be the hero. They could allow that captain to have a sense of humor because they could be the hero too. But it was part of the greater story that Southwest was trying to create.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny. I have a Southwest story, which is ironic because I think everybody does. But you said a humorous, pilot. I remember flying Southwest for one of the first times and not really knowing anything about the story until I really got steeped into entrepreneurship and the idea of businesses and breaking molds and whatnot. But I remember the pilot coming on, or maybe it was the steward, but they said, we have a first time flyer. They're 100 years old, yada yada. Let's give it up for our pilot. And everybody was just laughing and having a great time. But I think a lot of people have Southwest stories because of this very thing. They're shifting the paradigm of what it meant. And in this show, we talk a lot about that being the purpose. What is your purpose in life? And then what are the values that you want to live by in order to fulfill that purpose? And so I think that's vital and inundates a lot of different industries and a lot of different places. But one of the things that Andrew, that people might be listening to this show going, okay, 2 episodes ago, we had a guy to come on and talk about financial wellness. Another episode, it was about longevity. Another episode, it was about this idea of storytelling, right? And so sometimes people have trouble keeping up with me, and I have to apologize to my listeners sometimes because they're like, what does this have to do with what I want out of life, Coach Woody? Like, how does this align? But I would argue, and we talked about this a little bit before we hopped on air, that in order to be somebody who achieves at a high level, we need to be able to bring people on board. We need to be able to get people to see the vision and then go along with it. And so as you think about high achievers and the individuals that you maybe have worked with in the past, why do you believe, and this may align a little bit with why you got into this work to begin with, but why do you believe that leadership is so important in order to make an impact in this world?
Yeah, a lot of times people feel like they have to enter the ministry to impact people's lives, and I think that's a fabulous thing if people want to do that, of course. But as a leader, you actually have your people more than the pastor. You've got them for 40 hours a week; they've got them for an hour. You can have a massive impact on people's lives, and I believe that leadership, being a leader, is a tremendous responsibility. That you can positively or negatively impact the quality of not just that person's life, but every person they have the privilege to touch. So there's think about a spider's web coming out from the people that work for you. You're either making it better or worse. Now, every time two people get together, if I'm this person leaves either better or worse. They do not leave exactly the same. I either improve their life, I improve their temperament, I improve the way they're seeing things, or I make it worse. And so as a leader, you need to look at the people you're engaged with and ask, did I make their life better or worse today? And we have all sorts of reasons, all sorts of excuses, all sorts of rationales for why we aren't our best self, right? But the truth of the matter is, it's an ideal we need to strive for as a leader. You mentioned the concept of vision, and I think vision is important. Purpose is important. The problem is we make it very corporate. When we're in businesses, we don't really make it human. And I had a client years ago, Mohawk Industries. Some of you will be familiar with Mohawk Industries, large floor covering manufacturer, and they had a large customer service group. At the time, I think they had about 400 people in their customer service group. And Mohawk, of course, had their vision, right? The problem was the vision meant nothing to the customer service agents. Like, we're going to be the biggest, blah, 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 blah. And it's not that it was a bad vision. It was a good vision. Don't get me wrong. But it didn't mean anything to the customer service agents who are dealing with problems day after day after day after day, right? Taking orders from dealers and stuff. So we sat down as a group and we said, well, what is important to these people? Like, where are we and where do we want to be and what would be important to them? And we came up with a statement. We said that we will be, or we will deliver, the highest customer service by creating a culture of investment in our associates where we become the place they go to become the people they want to be. And it took about 6 months, but their turnover went down remarkably. Their performance went up incredibly. And the other departments still cherry picked their best, not always their best people, but their people. But all of a sudden, it wasn't the place you went to get hired somewhere else because all those other departments weren't behaving the way that customer service department was. So people wanted to work for that particular group. So I think as a leader, the key is to make the vision and the purpose personal to the group you're seeking to lead. And a lot of times leaders will say to me, well, what if it doesn't align with what the company wants? I'm like, that hardly ever happens. If you can create it personal and you can make it meaningful for your team, it almost always stitches up to what the greater company wants to accomplish, unless you go off on some desert island somewhere, right? But it's almost always relevant. So I think we get too corporate, and if we just get human, like what do my people want, and how do I help them create that so that they want to be working here, not that they have to be.
Yeah. I think too the you mentioned this idea of corporate versus personal. I think there's been a gigantic shift in the way that business is working. I think we still hold on to a lot of I can't think of a term better than old school right now, but old school ways of doing things. And so some of those things were phenomenal, and they will continue to work. I don't like the adage of it's either this or that, right? Like, there are things that worked in the past that worked for a reason, and to just completely disregard them because they are older in presence, I think is erroneous. I also think that to ignore new opportunities because they are so new is also erroneous. There's a place for both things. I will say that there's been a large shift in the terms of the workplace, both in terms of how we do work remotely, technologically, how corporations are structured, decentralizing of hierarchies, and really even the idea of individualism of organizations, a team of one. So with all of these different shifts, Andrew, have you seen any trends that you are starting to work through that you are recognizing have had a big impact in the way leadership is done? And I'd like to avoid the easy low-hanging fruit of like remote work is hard to lead, if you want to touch into that a little bit. But I'm sure that there are some other trends happening that you're seeing in this shift of the way that work is happening and how leadership is being involved in it. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think leadership is way more personal now. I think that, COVID microwave change, and we put about 10 years of change into 3 months. I think all the stuff that we were working on prior to COVID just like became critical almost overnight. So it's not that people changed or leadership changed. I think good leadership's always been good leadership. There are leadership principles, and they're called principles for a reason, right? But I think what's changed is the urgency with which organizations need to apply good leadership, because people just won't put up with crap anymore. They're like, you know what? Life is short. There's a great statistic that shows young people today, and I hate talking about young people, but young people today, and at my age, young people is a very broad swath of demographic, of course, right? But young people today will work harder for a purpose than a paycheck. Right. And you've heard that. And so all of our talk earlier about purpose and why purpose is important. Why are we doing what we're doing? I don't know about you. My kids are grown now, but when they used to ask me why, I used to say, because I said so, which was never a good reason, even with my kids. So because I said so doesn't work well with our employees, right? They want to know why. And for some leaders, they're like, what does it matter? Like, you're going to do it anyway. Just do what I'm asking you to do. I promise you it'll work. But let's think back to our hero, villain, and guide, right? That's definitely not the guide. The guide helps people understand where they are and gets them excited about where they're going and helps create a path. Both the hero and the villain say, just do what I tell you to do and it'll all work out. People don't want to be led that way anymore. They don't. In fact, people don't want to be led, period. People don't mind following someone they believe in, but they don't want to follow someone they don't believe in. And they don't really believe that that person has their best interests at heart. Now, it doesn't take that long to establish that type of relationship with an employee. People think it takes a long time. It actually doesn't. You can establish these types of relationships very, very quickly. But it means I put your interests before mine. Like, I'm not trying to figure out how to manipulate you to get you to do what I want you to do. I'm trying to figure out why you would want to do it in the first place. And if I've hired the right person, I should have chosen somebody who at least had the raw material to do the job properly, right? So that's another subject maybe we can get into in another podcast. But hiring has become probably the quintessentially important skill that leaders must master. And I see so many leaders like sort of delegating hiring to the HR group, and nothing against the HR group. They cannot figure out who you need on your team. They can help screen, but they cannot hire.
Mm-hmm.
Well, long
Yeah,
answer to your question. I apologize.
no, not at all. It's the right answer. And that's, I think that there's so many pertinent aspects to what you were saying, which is, this idea that the HR team can't hire. Let's just touch on that for a second, because there's so many things I could touch on. But I think that that's a phenomenal concept and conversation for people to really listen in on, because if you truly are the leader, then you should have the vision, right? You should be able to articulate that vision. Go back to Michael Haig's storytelling, right? You should be able to articulate that vision, but you should be able to have it and be able to share it. And if you truly have the vision, it doesn't matter how good you are at sharing. Nobody's going to know it exactly. And therefore, nobody's going to know who you need to bring on board. So I think that that's such an important message for people to hear. Do not delegate your team, because your team is the one that's going to help you fulfill the vision, and you need to be able to articulate that very well. I think that your other conversation of this idea of hiring well and younger individuals really wanting to live on purpose versus living for a paycheck or working for a paycheck. People have this argument of nobody's loyal anymore, nobody sticks around anymore. And one of my favorite quotes, no matter how flat you make a pancake, there's always two sides. So there may be a piece of people jumping ship very quickly, right? That's happening more and more. And we could say a lot of different things that would associate, or that could be correlated to that. Maybe not causation, but correlation. But I will also say, to your point, they have options now. They don't have to put up with it. And so if you aren't the type of person that they're willing to get behind, or in my opinion, beside, and walk this path because you can't articulate the vision well, and you don't have a vision, and you don't know how to bring people on board and help them understand why this is going to benefit them in their life, then they're going to go find another option. So I think, to your point, I think you said that so very well. They just won't put up with it anymore, which leaders need to recognize. Like, they need to step up their game and stop blaming other people.
Yeah, and we talk about young people, but I've seen this cascading up to the generations now. It actually started with the, young people. By the way, and I know a lot of them were probably unrealistic and stuff like that, but it started to. I've seen it bump up to the generations now, where all the generations are saying, like, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? Like, so I don't think this is just young people. I love the quote. It said, "Complaining about young people is like yelling at the wind. It doesn't change the wind, and you're going to get more and more tired." So, when people say young people today, whatever follows it is usually some complaint. And I'm like, okay, but like, you don't solve a problem by sort of just identifying the problem. And what I find leaders do a lot, and this might be helpful for your audience, is they start their questions with why. Like, why are young people the way they are? Why does this happen? Why can't I find motivated people? Why can't I? And the problem with the why question is you'll always get a million answers, but they're very sort of static answers. It can keep you exactly where you are, right? So if you want to make progress in your life, you have to move from why questions to how questions. How do I motivate young people today? Now, the problem with a how question is you don't know the answer to the question. And so what we do is we move from the questions we know the answers to, from the questions we don't know the answers to the ones we do. We just get busy with what we know. Now, the problem with that is I get stuck exactly where I am. And so I would challenge your audience, what's one question you don't know the answer to? Write it down. And every single person you meet who has evidenced by their results that they know a little bit more than you about a particular thing, ask them. I mean, if Warren Buffett walked in the room right now and I wasn't expecting him, a fabulously successful investor, I'd be like, hi, right? I would not have good questions. You prepare for interviews, Woody. But if I knew he was coming and I had a list of really good questions to ask him, I could learn from his experience. I think as leaders, we're usually not walking down a path no one else has walked down. So what are some questions? Like, if you met the CEO of your company, or you met some fabulously successful entrepreneur, or somebody that you admire, what would you want to ask them? There isn't even that many different questions you need to sort of come up with. But what are some questions that you would ask somebody if you met them? And then just start journaling. I asked this question. Here's the answer that I got. So it's the questions you do not have answers to that will spur your progress in the future. The questions you know the answers to, they can't help you. You already know that stuff, right? But it's what you don't know that's going to move you further, faster.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you couldn't have said it better, Andrew. I think too, one thing that leaders often struggle with, and you can weigh in on this a little bit, is this idea that they have to have all the answers. Again, they have to be a hero. And so they don't like to ask questions. And the unfortunate circumstance I have found is if we're supposed to be guides for our team, which I do believe that we're supposed to be, then there's really only one person who can answer the following question, which is, how can I help my team succeed? And the answer to that question is my team. But one of the scariest things that a leader can do is ask their team, how can I help you succeed? Because then you have to realize, you have to admit you don't have all the answers. So have you found that to be the case in the leadership that you have work
Yeah.
on?
Yeah, in fact, a lot of times leaders don't want to ask that question, to your point, because it makes them look weak. And we have this Hollywood impression of leadership that leaders are strong. I mean, they're the hero, right? The Bruce Willis that it takes down an entire building with a single pen. That's not the real world. If you go and ask, would you rather work for a leader who has all the answers, who respects you and brings out the best in you? Almost everybody answers they want to work for a leader that is honest about their strengths and their weaknesses, right? So the first thing is we got to get rid of this idea that leaders, like you say, have all the answers. That is not who we'd want to work for, and I don't think it's who our employees want to work for either. So leaning into that and asking them, you now, when you ask questions, you have to ask to understand, not to figure out where they're wrong or right.
Mm.
There's a big difference between listening for understanding and listening for disagreement or agreement, right? And sometimes we just listen for the disagreement. Oh, see, that's where you're wrong. Listening to understand is very different. And so as a leader, being vulnerable enough to say, I don't know everything. Clearly, that's who people want to work for. And why we think they want to work for somebody who has all the answers, I don't know. Now, if you're an accountant and you don't know how to count, go figure that out first. Don't for most of us, that it's not our technical specialty that is the problem. It's our ways that we interact with people and maybe the creative ways we're trying to move the organization forward.
Yeah. Competence is typically not the issue, right? We know when we're not competent, or people will call us out very quickly, and then we won't get very far, and we'll be back on our what's going. Oh wow, that didn't work. So yeah, competence is not usually the issue. It's the confidence and the communication. I think that is vital. So Andrew, we have found a little bit of a conundrum here, because one of the things we're talking about here is this idea of leaders having the vision and being able to get people on board, and this idea of leaders not knowing all the answers and not being able to figure that out, right? So it's kind of like we're on two different ends of the spectrum, or at least it can appear that way. So for maybe a young leader or somebody who's trying to kind of upgrade themselves as leaders, that can be a little bit frustrating, I can imagine, hearing both of those things at the same time. I'm supposed to know the vision and know where we're going, but also not have all the answers. So what would you tell somebody who's kind of in this space of continuing to want to develop themselves as a leader or newer, when you try to tell them both of these things at the same time?
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between vision and tactics, right? So vision is the overall direction we're trying to go. There are principles, values we want to hold true to as leaders. But a lot of times the people around us know more than us. And when I first graduated from engineering school, I went to sell commercial air conditioning in Toronto, Canada. And in Canada, engineers wear a pinky ring. It was actually made from the iron of a bridge that collapsed that was engineered, designed incorrectly, and a bunch of people died. And so the idea being that when you set your pen down, your ring bangs the table, and it reminds you of the oath you took to public safety and ethics, right? So so the reason I tell you this, I'm on a job site, and everyone knows you're an engineer because you have the pinky ring on, okay, in Canada. So it's my first time on a job site. I'm selling these huge pieces of equipment, like these chillers that are 40 feet long, 15 feet high. They weigh tons and tons and tons. And there's this grizzled old plumber there. And he sees me coming. And he says, "Hey, you're from Train, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "I need to know how to pipe this chiller up." He's seen the ring. And I realized very quickly it was a trap, right? He knew how to pipe the chiller. He was testing me. And if I told him wrong, he was going to pipe it that way. Now, he wouldn't let the thing blow up, but he would pipe it exactly the way I told him to. And so I looked at him and I said, "You been doing this a long time?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "How have you been doing it?" And he said, well, he told me exactly how he'd been piping up the chillers for years. And I'm like, "Sounds right." And he just smiled at me and went about his business, right? He thought I was going to be an arrogant young whippersnapper who was going to try to tell him, the guy who'd been doing it for years, how to do his job. A lot of times, I had a leader last week who came to me. He said, "I'm managing people who are so much older than me. How do I gain their respect?" And I looked at him, I said, "Respect them." And he's like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "There's tons of stuff they know about the job that you don't know. Just respect their knowledge." He said, "But what if they're telling me something that they should do and I know it's wrong?" I'm like, "Well, then have a conversation with them, because perhaps you have information they don't have." But it's rare that a decision is arbitrary, right? So if you have a direction you need to take and it's contrary to what they've been doing, sure, there's principles and processes around change management you can deal with it, but just talk to them about it. Talk to them about what you're trying to accomplish and what's shifted, and talk to them about the way they've been doing it, and will that still accomplish the thing that has changed? So as leaders, I think um, your question is a great one, but we can't confuse where we're headed with how we're going to get there. And a lot of times we lock in on a path and we want people to follow our path, but there's tons of different ways to get to an objective. And what's easiest for us is usually based on sort of our DNA, the way we're wired, and the way I do it might not be the way you would do it. So the way you're doing it just doesn't sound like that. That's not the right way to do it. You need to do it this way, Woody. And you're like, "Yeah, I don't think I can do it that way." So that's why, remember I said leadership is way more personal today. Mandating how people are going to achieve goals is not going to work as well as having a conversation with people about how they should achieve goals.
Yeah. For one, there those were some pretty awesome stories, especially the pinky ring. I mean, I wish we could go for days about that. I think that's a separate conversation, but just that idea of like, wow, what a responsibility on your shoulders, and a reminder, because every engineer has that responsibility. But do you wear it around on your ring, right? Do you wear it around on your hand every single day? I think that's great. One of the things that I heard from that story, Andrew, with the engineer themselves, the plumber that was talking to you, was this idea of curiosity. I think curiosity is such a powerful trait that leaders need to possess more and more of, because what I found, and one of the things I share with the people that I help with leadership, is this idea of there's a reason people choose to do things the way that they choose to do it. We do not go through the day just completely randomly like, I'm going to push this button and see what happens. Nobody does that. There's a reason we did it a certain way. Sometimes, let's be honest, it's laziness. We are sometimes built to do things the easiest way possible. And if I have no other motivation to do it the right way or the way that I think it needs to be done, then I'll do it lazily. But even then, there's a reason they chose to do it that way. For the most part, though, people want to do a good job. For the most part, yeah, right. And so if you can go into it with this idea of best intentions, I brought this person on board. Right. I'm the reason they're here. I believed in them at some level. And so now I need to be curious. Why did they go about doing it the way that they did? And I think your story about the plumber really leans into that idea. You just point blank asked him, how do you do it? And I think that that's really powerful.
Yeah. Now, if he told me the wrong way, I would have said, I don't know if I'd do it that way. But I knew he told me the right way.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the other thing too, is again, as leaders, we have the permission to call people out when they're not going to do it the right way. Is it going to be safe? It's the same thing with parenting. And I think leadership and parenting are the exact same thing. Right. But like, if your kid's going to fall off the roof and break something and have irreversible damage, then yes, you have a responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen. Like with the pinky ring, you have a responsibility to make sure that chiller doesn't blow up. And so you might have to step in and say no. And then afterwards, if it's an urgent thing, especially if it's like there's a fire, you might have to go back and be like, here's why I said no. Here's why I made the decision that I did. My wife last night called me out on this. I'm going to tell a dad story where I failed, but my son, I was singing a song about how my son didn't need any more food because he had a whole bunch of sweets. And I was being a little bit of a smart aleck. And so he was like, can you stop singing that dumb song? And at 6 years old, he's going to say a lot worse words than dumb, but we're trying to teach him right from wrong. Right. And so dumb is a bad word in our house. And so I told my son, hey, I'm not going to lay down with you tonight because you said that mean word. And in our house, we lay down and we read books, and that's part of the bedroom time routine. And my wife and I then got into an argument not because I thought that the word dumb was a bad word. We both agreed to that. We've had a lot of conversations about that. But because I was taking my attention away from him as a punishment for doing something wrong. And so she believed that wasn't the right approach. And there's lots of different parenting styles. This is not me trying to push a parenting style on anybody. But what was truthful about it, and one of the reasons I got upset, because I have an ego just like everybody else, and sometimes that ego doesn't want to admit when we're wrong, right? But one of the truths to that whole argument that I apologized to her later for was that she was right. Like, he needs to understand why this is so bad, and we need to make sure that the punishment as leaders is aligned with the wrongdoing. And taking away love from our child is not necessarily, in their eyes, love, right? And as adults, we're more mature. But I think that that's a really important thing to do too, is to realize that as a leader, you can still hold them accountable. In fact, it's necessary.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of people hold accountability equal to punishment. And I always ask, the best boss you ever worked for. I'll ask you, Woody, have you worked for other people?
I have. Since I own my own business now, it's not as much, but I believe I'm a servant leader. So I believe that I work for everybody that works with me and my clients and all those things. But yes, I have had bosses in the past. Yeah.
So the best boss you ever worked for, did they hold you accountable?
Yeah. One of the first people that I think of is one of my professors when the conversations of great leaders come up. And oh yeah, very high standards.
Did you care if you disappointed that person?
100%.
Yeah. See, and that's always what I get. So it's like, so you can't really hold anyone accountable, but you can create a culture, an environment where people want to hold themselves accountable, right? And so what does that look like? And we teach this concept with our clients And you have a minute for just me to go down this rabbit hole very quickly with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, we call it expect versus want. And
Mm.
one of my first mentors said to me, you should never expect anything you don't want. You should never want anything you don't expect, because expectation is a powerful magnet, right? People know what you expect from them. And I said, the problem a lot of times with our employees, we expect things we don't want and we want things we don't expect. And so to sort of draw this out, just imagine you have an employee and they're a fabulous employee, just awesome. Come to work on time, early, great attitude, work hard, help other people, always generous in the way that they give their time to others. And then one day they come in and they're rude and they were a little bit late. They look like sluts in their clothes. Are you mad at them or are you concerned about them? You're concerned, aren't you? That's not what I expect from that person, right? But let's reverse it. Let's say you have an employee that's a ne'er-do-well. You don't know why you hired him. In fact, you didn't even hire him. Somebody else foisted them on you before you got the team. They're always late. They have a bad attitude. They're frustrating to other people. They're always trying to get out of work. They want to leave early all the time. And then one day they come in and they're late and they don't look like they slept in their clothes and they're not helpful and they've got a bad attitude. Are you concerned with that employee or are you more likely to feel frustrated with them? And of course, we feel frustrated with that employee. The reason we feel frustrated with the second employee, the not so good employee, is we don't expect good behavior from them. We actually expect bad behavior from them. We have lowered our expectation to their performance level, which is understandable, but it's actually very detrimental, because as soon as I lower my expectation to their performance level, I have abdicated the role of leader. They're actually leading the relationship now. They have reset my expectation level. Now, I'm not saying, you may have an employee that's up here. I'm not saying you expect them to be like that employee, but should have a reasonable expectation of that employee. And when they deviate from the expectation level, you should have a conversation with them to try to understand. Help me understand. When I hired you, I said that there were 3 core values with our business, and this is what they were. And I've noticed these behaviors from you that I think you would agree transgress our core values. And can you help me understand what's happening? And that is an accountability conversation. I'm not mad. In fact, getting mad with an employee is a clear indication that you have lowered your expectations to their current level of performance. And I'm not talking about if they stole something or, something, horrible. I'm talking about they're late. And usually it's been going on for a while and we haven't addressed it, by the way, which is why we're upset. So we should be careful that we keep our expectations exactly the same of all the people that work for us. Now, when we do our training with people, we talk about how to deal with higher performing people, but expectations should always be the same based on the position, not the performance of the individual in the position.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's awesome. So then my follow-up question to you, Andrew, is because I can already hear some people that are in the background, well, Susie or Dave or Jim, they're never going to get it, right? I wish I could just fire him and get on with it.
Right.
But for some reason they can't. And I don't know what that is. But typically it's because they're deep down, they don't want to do that to another human. Right. So they're frustrated all the time, but they know that they're not just going to fire somebody, or they don't have the capacity to do so, whether it's not their person, it's not their team, it's not their department, whatever. But whatever the reason may be, they're with that person. What do you tell these individuals to do to get back those expectations and then help them continue to grow? How do you bring them back up? How do you raise the bar up without, Susie or Dave or Jimmy slamming their head in the bar because they weren't ready for it?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a great point, is that we have a tendency, if this is the expectation level, right? And say Sally or Jimmy is way down here, right? We want to get them here, but it's a bridge too far for them. Now you might think, well, it's not even that hard. See, all problems look easy from the side where you've solved the problem. But if I have the problem, that problem doesn't look easy at all. So the question is, I could say, now, Sally, here's where we need to get you to. Now, first of all, do you agree that that's a reasonable expectation? I'm not asking if you can do it right now, but do you agree that's probably a reasonable expectation for this job? And do you agree this is where you are? So now we've got the endpoints of the journey identified, right? You might like to talk about why it's important to get to that level of performance. Now, once we have the endpoints of the journey involved, we say, all right, so what's the very first change that person can make that would help them make progress on the journey? Not the hardest one, not the most significant one, not the one that I want them to make. What's one thing they could do that would help them make progress. And if we can say, all I want you to focus on here, we're going to try to get there, but all I want you to focus on right now is this. I want you to focus on doing this differently. And then you follow up with them and you praise them when it actually gets done. A lot of times we don't praise people for the stuff that they do that we think they should be doing anyway, because like, what do I have to do? Cake because they came to work on time? No. You don't have to bake them a cake, but what you should do is say, thank you. I appreciate it. I noticed we had the conversation about you coming to work, and I noticed for the last 3 days you've been on time. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to the team because of X. And then, because otherwise, the only time you give them feedback is when they screw up, right? So, positive feedback needs, just like you said, your feedback to your son needed to be proportional to what he had done. Our positive feedback should also be proportional to what was done, right? I don't have to make a big deal of it, but I can actually point out that I appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, everybody, I think the leaders should challenge themselves a little bit because you hear it almost all the time in their head or in your own head when somebody finally does, they show up to a meeting on time as opposed to 3 minutes late, and the first response in their head is about time because they've held on to all this frustration and anger about all the times they've messed up.
Right.
I've found, and I don't know if this is something you work on with your clients, is like you have to almost cut ties. You have to decide, like from this point on is when we judge. We're letting go of all those other things, because if not, they're climbing out of a hole that's just impossible. Give them a chance and just say, from this point forward, how many times have they been late? From this conversation we're having, and even tell them that I'm wiping the slate clean. It's in the past. We can't change the past. Nobody can. Nobody should be asked to.
That's right.
But how do we do that? And so I think your comment of like making it proportional. Everybody wants to be appreciated. Everybody wants to be recognized for the work that they do. And so if that work is, to them, showing up to a meeting on time was the challenge, and it was a success. And so everybody has the right to be appreciated for those things.
It's true. And we have this tendency sometimes to observe something that bothers us in somebody's performance, and we don't talk to them, but we talk to ourselves in our head. Like, we have the conversation up here. Now, the subconscious mind can't tell the difference between what's real and what's imagined. And if you don't believe me, just for a minute, if you're old enough to remember chalkboards, imagine someone drawing a nail down a chalkboard, right? Look at the emotion. Now, there's no chalkboard, there's no nail, right? You had an emotional, visceral, physical reaction to a mental construct because you associate it with a noise, right? So the subconscious mind can't tell the difference, right? So when you have the conversation in your head, emotionally, it's like you had it with them, but you didn't. So if this happens 4, 5, 6, 7 times, and I'm like, I'm going to talk to them, and here's what I'm going to say. When you finally go talk to them, it's like you've talked to them 8 times. But unfortunately for them, you haven't. You have not talked to them. Now, you could argue and say, well, they should know. Well, perhaps. But that's an assumption, and perhaps they should know. But I was coaching someone just the other day, and they had somebody who kept coming home from lunch late, come back from lunch late. And I was coaching. I said, hey, so ask him what's going on. He's like, he knows what's going on. He's just, I said, what? But just ask him. Ask him what's happening. And you know what he told him? He said, I was just seeing how long I could do this until you talked to me about it. And he's like, I said, how long has it been going on? He's like, 2 weeks. I'm like, so could you have done that day one? He's like, I probably could have. And he probably wouldn't have done it from that point forward. So we think accountability has to be punitive, and it doesn't. Accountability is just setting parameters. This is what's acceptable in this job, and if you're outside of this, I'm going to talk to you about it. I'm not going to. There's a big difference between a corrective action conversation, which is where you're threatening someone's employment, and a coaching conversation where we're just indicating there's a differential between where we are and where the expectation for performance should be.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's funny. You mentioned this idea of you've had a conversation with them 5 or 6 times. So I'm a firm believer in the practice of mindfulness and whatever practice you want to use for that, journaling, meditation. I do both because my mind does race a lot. And so I found it to be really helpful. But one of the things that I try to catch myself with is what I call monologuing.
Mm.
So I will have a conversation in my head with of an argument with my, my wife or my team or my client or whatever about how I'll make an assumption of how they're going to feel, and then I'm going to create a whole speech in my head about how I'm going to retort to that. And I know there are people listening right now going, yeah, I do that. And so that's something that I have, you mentioned having that conversation 4 or 5 times. That's something that I've had to practice through my mindfulness practices of I make a mental note, Lucas, you're monologuing again. And I've had clients who have had, when I'm working with them, because in the work that I do, we talk about relationships. We don't talk about just leadership. We talk about relationships at home, relationships at work. It's the social aspect of the model that I use for helping people with their life. And so we talk about relationships, and I've had clients who've been like, well, my wife, I know she feels this way about this thing. I know she does. Out of their mouth, I know she does. And so I stop them because that's a big yellow flag for me as a coach. I was like, can you tell me how you know that?
Right.
Well, I know it. And I'm like, we've been married for 12 years. I know it. Has she told you that? Is that come out of her mouth? Because until it does, you don't know it. You're assuming it. And I think same thing here is, well, I know they know what they're doing wrong. And it's just not the case.
Yeah. Yeah. I think clarity of expectations precedes all progress. So if you're in a relationship with someone, what are the expectations? Are they reasonable? Right? If you're managing someone, what do you expect? We do an exercise called the scorecard with our clients, where we go through the key accountabilities for a position, the metrics, the key performance indicators. We look at what we're going to hold them accountable to, and the competencies that are required, the skills that are required in the job, and getting clarity on that scorecard, because everybody wants to know if they're winning or losing, right? And so the question really becomes, if you feel like someone's not measuring up, how do you know they know? Getting mad at someone, by the way, somebody asked me one time and said, is it ever okay to get mad at an employee? I'm like, it depends on the employee, right? But for the most part, the answer is no. But there are certain employees, if you don't have a little bit of an emotional edge to your voice, they won't pay attention. But what it's never okay is to lose control. So
Yeah.
I could be heated in the way I'm conversing with somebody to get their attention, but I'm completely in control. The problem is usually when we're heated, we're not in control. We're
Yeah.
saying what feels good to us, and we've lost focus that this is not about me, it's about them. And how do I
Yeah.
communicate with them in order to help them bridge the gap between where they are and where we truly like them to be?
Yeah. Yeah. When I work with my clients, one of the things I always try to do, empathy is our fourth core value. And so one of the things I always try to tell them is be mad for them. Be mad. Be mad because you know they can do better and
Right.
they're preventing themselves from doing it. Like be mad for them. Don't be mad at them.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Because then it becomes a conversation of like, hey, you want this for your family, you want this for your kids, you want this for your relationship, right? You want this for whatever happens to be. You want to do well in this job. You've told me that. And I think there's a big part of this is you have to know what they want out of their job. You have to have those conversations like, why are you here? What do you expect out of this? What do you expect out of me as a leader? Yada yada. But being mad for them, because to your point, without emotion, they don't understand the urgency, they don't understand the power, they don't understand the desires, they don't understand why this is so important. That's how we communicate importance, is through emotion. But you're absolutely right, you can't be mad at them, because when you're mad at them, you're attacking them as the person and you're making them the problem, and they're not typically the problem.
No, they're really not. And when you make them the problem, you're going to get defensiveness from them. And when defensiveness occurs, all learning ceases. And if learning ceases, then the future doesn't shift. Right. And what we want as leaders is we want a different future. I don't really care why they did what they did. I only want to understand that so that I understand how to bridge the gap so we can figure out what they need to do differently. So when people are locked in on the past, what we need to be careful of as leaders is that we don't become defensive and attack them, because now we're modeling what we don't want. I have to be in learning mode. If I want them in learning mode and someone's become very defensive, which is a big problem leaders experience when they try to create accountability, they're like, they become defensive. I'm like, well, the hard question to answer then is, what is it that I'm doing that's causing that defensiveness? And they're like, well, it's not me. I'm like, well, how do you know? How do you know it's not you? Maybe it is you. Well, at least we should start there. And we should ask, what could I do differently? Because you can't change them. I love Dr. Wayne Dwyer's quote. He had this great quote. He said, if you think the rest of the world is the source of your problems, you're going to have to send the rest of the world to the psychiatrist for you to get better. Of course, that's not going to work, right? So I got to work on me. I can't work on them. So, what do I need to do different with this? Now, ultimately, if I do everything I know how to do and I can't move them, maybe this isn't the right place for them. But I got to work on me first. I got to work on how I'm interacting with people. And I think one of the biggest challenges leaders have is that we all were taught when we were growing up that we should treat other people the way we want to be treated, right? Which is great advice in morality and ethics. It's horrible advice in leadership.
Mm.
What if you're not like me? What if you're very different than me? I'm mismanaging you then. I'm trying to make things better, but I'm making them worse. So the question isn't how do I want to be treated? The question is how do they want to be treated? How do they need to be managed? How do they need to experience feedback? What would be motivational for them? What kind of relationship do they want? How do they want to experience work? What works for them, not what works for me. What works for me. That's why people they manage people who are just like them really well, but people who are different, they're the problem children, right? And so how do I bridge that gap with those people that are different?
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of leaders might hear that and go, well, then I'll just make a team of all me's, right? And then it'll be easy. But the problem with that is now you have a very one-sided conversation, and those typically go downhill pretty fast.
Yeah. And, I wrote a book a few years back called The Four Faces of Frustration. It's about a CEO that takes over a group of leaders and a company, and all four of the leaders are different, right, that report into him. And the way I would characterize this is if everybody's the same, then there will be no friction on the team, right? Well, if you've ever been on an ice surface that's been recently resurfaced and there was no friction, it's hard to make progress because you need a little bit of friction in order to be able to go forward, right? Not fall. Now, too much friction and all progress ceases. So part of a job as a leader is to manage the friction on the team so that we can make progress. But having everyone just like me will reduce the friction, but it will also ultimately reduce the progress that the team is able to make.
Yeah. Absolutely. Andrew, with an eye on time, I do want to touch on one thing because I think it's vital. It's pretty important in our day and age. We talked a little bit off air about this gap between kind of I'm going to again say old school, even though there's so many benefits to the way that things have been done in terms of leadership. And then the younger individuals, again, coming up who want to become better leaders, but they feel like there's this tremendous gap in how to do so. And I think we could blame it on so many different things, COVID, technology, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of people who want to be leaders who feel as though maybe there's a gap in terms of how they can become leaders. I have found one of the ways to help them understand how they can develop themselves as a leader is to realize you can lead from anywhere. And you mentioned that when you talked about your story about the plumber who thought you were going to be some young whippersnapper who came in and told him what to do, but you led him in a tremendously thoughtful way that maybe you didn't even realize at the time was so powerful. And it's that idea of like you can lead from anywhere if you approach it in a certain way. So what would you share with those individuals who are like, I'm not a leader by title, which we both know is the worst way to not the weakest way to get a leadership role, right? Is just be called a leader. But as they continue to want to develop themselves as a younger leader who's coming up, what would you kind of help them think through?
Yeah. Yeah. I love Robin Sharma's book, The Leader Without a Title. And if you haven't ever read that book, The Leader Without a Title, it's a great book. Titles don't make you a leader, right? A lot of times people think, well, when I'm in charge, I'll do this and I'll do that. And the problem is that when you get in charge, nobody wants to follow you anyway. I mean, having a title doesn't make people want to do what you want them to do. All it does is give you the authority to make them. And when you use your authority, you lose your authority to a degree, right? So I'm not saying you don't ever use your authority as a leader, but really you want to work on the influence that you have with people. Now, influence is a skill you can work on whether you have people working for you or you don't have people working for you. So one of the sort of litmus tests that I always ask people in terms of the amount of influence they have, I say to them, how many people come to you for advice that don't have to? So whether you're in a frontline position or a leadership position, do people come to me and seek me out and ask me, so what do you think about this? Like, what are your thoughts? Because if nobody's doing that, I don't have a lot of influence in the organization. But if I build that skill of influence at a frontline position and people see me as somebody, as they're a resource, somebody who's interested in them, interested in their goals, interested in what they're trying to accomplish, versus the only time they see my name on their phone is when I need something from them, then I'm building a very core skill that's going to help me when I actually enter a true organizational leadership position, because personal leadership is, or sorry, organizational leadership's built on personal leadership. So how much influence do you have right now with people? Go find people that, you interact with that you could help, and just help them. Help them with that servant mentality you were talking about earlier, because it's the right thing to do, not because you're going to get anything from it. And you'll build such solid relationships that when a leadership position becomes available, it'll be a no-brainer. People are like, well, of course we're going to put like Fred in that position. I mean, he's already acting like he's a leader in the organization, not acting like he's in charge, acting like a leader, somebody who gives without an expectation of return.
That's a tremendous litmus test. I'm always constantly trying to think of ways to add to my surveys and my questionnaires and my ways that people can kind of measure themselves. And I have just officially added that one to my list. So thank you, which is that idea of like, how do you want to know if you have influence over people? How many people are coming to you unsolicited to ask for your advice? I can't imagine a better way to determine whether or not people respect you and your opinion.
A little sidebar on that. When they come to you and ask for your advice, the way to build influence with that person is not to necessarily tell them exactly what to do. It's to ask really good questions and maybe help them figure out what they need to do. You probably know this. A lot of times people come to me for advice and I'm like, I've never dealt with that, but I ask them really good questions. And after about 30 minutes, they're like, thank you. I really appreciate the advice. And I'm like, I didn't give them advice. I actually just helped them think through the problem, which has actually built your influence with the person even more than just firing off an answer at them really quickly.
And it all comes back to the idea that you're no longer the hero. You're the
That's
guide.
right. Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Andrew, this has been a tremendous conversation about leadership and how to increase influence through the people that you serve and the people that you work with. Where can people go if they want to continue this conversation, to learn more about you, the work that you're doing, the frameworks that you have? How do they find you?
Yeah, probably the best place is on LinkedIn, which is at Andrew Oxley. Try to make it simple. Would be our LinkedIn handle. We also, for the people who listen to your podcast, Coach Woody, we have a workshop that we do where we take about an hour and a half and go through really in depth some pretty interesting concepts. If you want more information on that, send an email to info@transformingresults.com. That's info@transformingresults.com. Just put workshop in there. For the people who register for our workshop, we're going to provide a free copy of our book, The Four Faces of Frustration, as our gift to you. And that workshop is just our gift as well to people who listen to your podcast who'd like to know more.
Awesome. Andrew, thank you so much for the opportunity to learn from you and to talk about this thing called leadership. We need it desperately in our world, even more so. There are tremendous leaders already out there, and if we can continue to improve them and ourselves, and it's going to be a great world.
Thank you, Wade. I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. Make it a great day.
Thank you.
I loved this conversation with Andrew. What about that litmus test to decide whether or not you're ready for leadership, even if you don't have the title, by asking yourself if people are coming to look to you for advice and input without you being their direct supervisor? I love that. And the framework to shift your mentality from being the hero of your organization to being the guide for the people who are the heroes, which are the people that you serve in your leadership capacity. So many phenomenal ideas on how to become better as a leader from Andrew Oxley. So if you want to continue to develop yourself as a leader or an entrepreneur or as any type of high achieving individual so that you can increase your influence, so that you can contribute more meaningfully to this world, then be sure to check us out. Nextbetter.com is where you can find all the work that we're doing for these servant-hearted, growth-minded high achievers like yourself. You can check out our podcast where you can listen to full episodes of this podcast and the AMA show that we do every other week. That's the Next Better podcast. You can check that out anywhere that you subscribe, Apple, Spotify, anywhere you want to go to. You can also check us out on our YouTube channel at The Next Better for all sorts of shorts and clips and motivational ideas and inspiration for your daily life. And if you want to check us out on our newsletter, you can sign that up for that through my LinkedIn post. You can check me out at Coach Lucas Woody or on the nextbetter.com website. And every other week, we're going to send you our podcast, our AMA show, our blog posts, our book reviews, everything that you're going to need to continue to be the high achiever you are. Until then, make it a great day.